You have 10 minutes for me, not an hour, not a lifetime, just 10 minutes. And I know what you're thinking. 10 minutes can't change anything. It can't fix what's broken. It can't erase the years you lost, the chances you missed, the nights you barely survived. But listen closely. Every turning point in your life begins in a moment shorter than this. One decision, one breath, one sentence you chose to believe or ignore. You don't need motivation for the rest of your life. You don't need a perfect plan. You don't even need confidence right now. All I'm asking for is 10 minutes. 10 minutes to stop running from yourself. 10 minutes to hear the truth you've been avoiding. 10 minutes to remember who you were before the world told you to shrink. Because if you can give me these 10 minutes, I promise you something simple but real. You want to walk away from the same person who sat down. And that is how everything begins. You have 10 minutes for me, not because you're free, but because you're tired. Tired of pretending you still have time. Tired of telling yourself you'll deal with it later. Tired of carrying things you never planned to hold this long. 10 minutes isn't generous. It's honest. It's what people give when they don't know what else to give anymore. And that's enough. Because the truth never needed a long introduction. It just needed you to stop moving long enough to hear it. You didn't arrive here by accident. People like to say everything happens for a reason, but that's not always comforting when the reason feels like pain, loss, or failure stacked so high you stop counting. Still, something inside you said pause, sit, listen. Even if you don't know why yet. Especially if you don't know why yet. 10 minutes is what you give when you're unsure, when hope feels expensive, when belief feels risky. 10 minutes is a crack in the wall, and light doesn't need more than that. You've spent years thinking transformation requires drama, a breakdown, a breakthrough, a loud moment where everything finally makes sense. But most real change happens quietly, when no one is watching, when the noise fades and you're left alone with yourself. That's what these 10 minutes are, not a performance, not a promise. Just a space where you don't have to impress anyone, not even yourself. You keep waiting to feel ready, ready to start, ready to heal, ready to forgive, ready to become the person you imagine in your better moments. But readiness is a story we tell ourselves to delay discomfort. Nobody wakes up ready for the hardest conversation of their life. Nobody feels prepared to let go of who they've been. They just arrive at a moment where staying the same hurts more than changing. If you're here, it's because that moment has already started tapping on your door. Think about how much time you've spent surviving, not living, surviving, learning how to get through days instead of how to feel them. You adapted, you became functional, you learned how to smile when you were empty, how to nod when you were lost, how to say, I'm fine in 100 different tones. Survival taught you a lot, but it also taught you how to ignore yourself. These 10 minutes are not about fixing your life. They're about remembering it. There are things you never said out loud because you didn't know who would listen. Things you buried because they didn't fit the version of you that everyone else needed. Regrets you replay at night. Questions you never ask because you're afraid of the answers. You don't need to solve them now. You don't need clarity. You just need honesty. Honesty doesn't shout, it whispers, and it usually starts with discomfort. You've been measuring your worth by outcomes, by how far you've come compared to others, by timelines that were never designed for your life. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that being behind meant being broken, but time doesn't move the same for everyone. Some people bloom early and fade quietly. Others struggle longer and carry deeper roots. Your pace is not a verdict. It's a process. 10 minutes won't erase your past. It won't undo mistakes or rewrite chapters you wish you could forget, but it can change how you carry them. Pain doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It waits. It shows up in your reactions, your silence, your distance. You don't need to relive everything to move forward. You just need to stop running from it. Notice how often you tell yourself you'll start when things calm down, when you have more money, more confidence, more support. But life doesn't slow down to give permission. It keeps moving. The calm you're waiting for is built by action, not gifted by time. 10 minutes is not about doing everything. It's about doing one thing differently. Listening instead of scrolling, feeling instead of numbing, staying instead of escaping. You're not weak for being tired. You're tired because you've been strong for too long without rest. Strength without reflection becomes a burden. You learned how to carry weight, but no one taught you when to put it down. These 10 minutes are not a test. They're an invitation to sit with yourself without judgment, without fixing, without pretending you've outgrown some versions of yourself, and that's uncomfortable. Growth doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it feels like confusion, like loss, like standing between who you were and who you're becoming with no clear map forward. That space is not failure, it's transition. And transition is quiet, uncertain, and deeply human. Think about the moments that shaped you. Not the big ones everyone celebrates, but the small ones you never talk about. The night you realized something was over. The morning you got up anyway. The choice you made when no one was watching. Those moments didn't ask for permission, they just happened. This is one of those moments. Smaller than you expect, more important than you realize. You don't need to be inspired. Inspiration fades. You need presence. Presence stays for 10 minutes. You don't have to be productive. You don't have to be positive. You don't have to have answers. You just have to be here, fully, honestly, without rushing to the next distraction. There's a version of you that knows what you've been avoiding, not because you're afraid, but because you're human. Change costs something. Even good change, it costs familiarity, it costs excuses, it costs the comfort of blame. 10 minutes won't force you to change. It will simply show you the truth you already feel but haven't named. You've been listening to too many voices telling you who to be, what success looks like, how healing should happen, when you should be over it by now. But your life is not a checklist, it's a conversation. And you've been doing all the talking except with yourself. If all you do in these 10 minutes is breathe differently, that matters. If all you do is realize you're not as lost as you thought, that matters. Big shifts begin with subtle awareness. Awareness is the first form of courage. You don't owe anyone a finished version of yourself. You don't owe the world your pain packaged neatly into lessons. You're allowed to be unfinished. You're allowed to take your time. Ironically, that begins when you stop waiting for the perfect time and accept the one you're in. 10 minutes won't solve your life. It doesn't need to. It just needs to interrupt the pattern. The pattern of postponing yourself. The pattern of believing later is safer than now. The pattern of thinking one day you'll feel ready to show up fully. This is not about pressure, it's about permission. Permission to acknowledge where you are without comparing it to where you think you should be. Permission to admit that something inside you wants more, even if you don't know what that looks like yet. When these 10 minutes end, the world won't magically change. Your responsibilities will still be there. Your challenges won't vanish, but you might stand up carrying yourself differently, less numb, less rushed, more honest. And that difference quietly changes how you step into the next moment and the next and the next, because momentum doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from clarity. And clarity often arrives when you finally stop long enough to listen, when you let the noise settle and notice that the thing you've been searching for outside has been waiting patiently inside, asking not for years, not for promises, not for perfection, just for 10 minutes where you don't look away, where you don't minimize what you feel, where you allow the truth to exist without immediately trying to escape it, because once you see it clearly, once you feel it without judgment, you can't unsee it. And that awareness starts changing the way you speak to yourself, the way you make decisions, the way you tolerate what no longer fits. And even if nothing else happens today, even if all you do is sit with that awareness a little longer than usual, something has already shifted, something has already begun, something that doesn't need an ending to be real. You don't need readiness. That idea has been sold to you like a requirement, like a gate you're supposed to pass through before you're allowed to begin. Be ready, be confident, be healed, be certain. But readiness is usually just fear wearing a more respectable name. It's hesitation dressed up as responsibility. You've been telling yourself you're not there yet for a long time, and every time you say it, you buy a little more distance from the life you actually want to live. Presence doesn't wait. It doesn't ask if you're prepared. It doesn't care if your hands are shaking, or your thoughts are messy. Presence simply asks one thing of you: are you here, or are you somewhere else pretending to listen? Most of your exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from not being where you are, from being physically present but mentally rehearsing the past or negotiating with the future. Think about how often you've delayed something important because you didn't feel ready enough, ready to speak up, ready to leave, ready to begin again. You told yourself you needed more time, more information, more reassurance, but what you were really waiting for was the fear to disappear. And it didn't. It never does. Fear doesn't leave when you wait. It settles in. It becomes familiar. It convinces you that staying still is safer than moving forward. Presence is different. Presence doesn't promise comfort. It offers clarity. When you're present, you stop negotiating with imaginary outcomes. You stop trying to control how everything will turn out. You deal with what's in front of you, not what might happen later. That's why presence feels uncomfortable at first. It removes your escape routes. You've spent a lot of time in your head analyzing, replaying, predicting, preparing for conversations that never happen, bracing for worst-case scenarios that don't arrive. Your mind has been working overtime to protect you, but it's also been keeping you stuck. Presence asks your mind to step back so you can actually feel what's happening instead of just thinking about it. You don't need to be fearless to be present. You just need to stop running from the fear. Fear loses some of its power when you look at it directly, not to defeat it, just to acknowledge it. When you stop trying to get rid of fear, you realize it's not a wall, it's a signal. It's telling you that something matters. There's a version of you that keeps waiting for permission. Permission to change, permission to rest, permission to want more. You look for it in other people's approval, in perfect timing, in signs that guarantee success. But permission doesn't come from outside. It never did. It comes from the moment you decide to stay present with your own truth, even if it's inconvenient. Presence doesn't mean you suddenly understand everything. It means you stop pretending you don't understand anything. It means admitting when something hurts instead of explaining it away. It means noticing when you're drifting and gently bringing yourself back without judgment. You've been taught that progress looks loud, that growth should be obvious, that healing should feel like relief. But sometimes growth feels like sitting still when every part of you wants to distract itself. Sometimes healing feels like boredom after chaos. Presence can feel empty at first because you're no longer filling every gap with noise. Notice how quickly you reach for distraction when things get quiet. The phone, the thoughts, the plans, the memories, anything to avoid being fully here. That habit didn't come from nowhere. It came from learning that your inner world was something to manage instead of something to listen to. Presence asks you to trust that you can handle what comes up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's unfinished. You don't have to solve everything you feel. You just have to stop abandoning yourself when feelings arise. You don't become present by force. You become present by choice. A quiet one, repeated over and over again. Each time you notice you've checked out and decide to return, that's not failure, that's practice. There are moments when you're so focused on becoming a better version of yourself that you forget to be the current one. You treat today like a waiting room for a future life, but life isn't waiting. It's happening in small, ordinary moments you barely register because you're always somewhere else. Presence changes how you listen, not just to others, but to yourself. You start hearing the signals you used to ignore, the tension in your body, the fatigue in your voice, the quiet dissatisfaction you kept pushing down. Those signals aren't weaknesses, they're information. You don't need motivation to be present. Motivation comes and goes. Presence is available even on days when you feel flat, uncertain, or uninspired. Especially on those days, presence doesn't ask you to feel good. It asks you to feel honestly. There's a fear that if you slow down and become present, you'll fall apart, that everything you've been holding back will rush in at once. But what actually happens is more subtle. Things surface at a pace you can handle. Your system knows how to regulate when you stop overwhelming it with constant distraction. Presence doesn't mean you stop planning for the future. It means you stop living in it prematurely. You still make decisions. You still take action. But those actions come from awareness instead of anxiety. You've mistaken readiness for worthiness, as if you have to earn the right to show up as you are. But you were worthy of presence before you learned how to perform, before you learned how to cope, before you learned how to hide. When you're present, you stop asking, "What should I be?" and start asking, "What is actually happening right now?" That question is grounding. It pulls you out of comparison, out of judgment, out of unnecessary urgency. Presence is what allows small changes to matter. When you're present, you notice patterns. You see where you're repeating the same responses. You catch yourself before automatic reactions take over. That awareness creates choice. You don't need to fix your entire life to be present. You don't need answers. You don't need certainty. You just need to stop postponing your attention. Stop treating your own experience like something you'll get to later. They've survived by being alert, by anticipating problems before they happen. Presence asks you to relax that vigilance just enough to notice that not everything is a threat, that some moments are neutral, some are even safe. When you're present, time changes. It slows down, not because the clock moves differently, but because you're actually there to experience it. Moments stop blurring together. You start remembering days again. Presence doesn't erase pain, but it prevents pain from multiplying. Suffering grows when you resist what's happening. When you're present, pain is just pain. Not a story about what it means about you, not a prediction of how things will always be. You don't have to be good at presence. You don't have to meditate perfectly or think the right thoughts. Presence isn't a skill you master. It's a relationship you rebuild with yourself. Each time you choose presence, you send yourself a quiet message: I'm her, with you, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. That message matters more than any motivational phrase you've ever heard. You've been waiting for a moment when you feel strong enough to face things directly, but strength grows through presence, not before it. You don't become strong and then show up. You show up and strength follows. Presence is what allows 10 minutes to matter, not because you do something impressive in that time, but because you stop splitting yourself between past regrets and future worries. You bring your full attention into one place. You may not realize it yet, but the fact that you're still listening means part of you is already present. That part has been waiting patiently while you stayed busy. It doesn't need encouragement. It just needs space. Being present doesn't mean you stop caring about outcomes. It means outcomes stop controlling you. You act because it aligns with what's true now, not because you're chasing relief later. You don't need to feel ready to stay. You just need to stop leaving. Stop leaving moments before they finish. Stop leaving conversations before they begin. Stop leaving yourself every time things get quiet. Presence is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It feels ordinary, simple, almost too simple to trust. But simplicity is often where truth hides. If you give these 10 minutes your presence, not your analysis, not your expectations, just your attention, something subtle starts to shift. You begin to notice that you're not as disconnected as you thought. You were just elsewhere for a long time, and now you're slowly, quietly returning. 10 minutes doesn't scare you because it's short. It scares you because it's enough time for excuses to fall apart, enough time for silence to get loud, enough time for the truth you've been avoiding to step forward without being rushed away. You've learned how to avoid things efficiently. You've had practice, years of it. You turned avoidance into a skill, into a habit, into something that almost looks like stability from the outside. Avoidance isn't always obvious. Sometimes it looks like productivity. Sometimes it looks like staying busy, staying useful, staying needed. Sometimes it looks like being the strong one, the reasonable one, the one who doesn't make things complicated. You learned early that some feelings slow things down, so you learned to step around them, not because you're dishonest, but because you were trying to survive. You didn't avoid things because you didn't care. You avoided them because you cared too much and didn't know what to do with that weight. So you postponed conversations, You minimized disappointments. You told yourself it wasn't that bad. You told yourself you'd deal with it later. Later became a pattern. Later became a place you lived in. Avoidance has a quiet cost. It doesn't break you all at once. It drains you slowly. It shows up as a low-level restlessness you can't explain, as a feeling that something is unfinished even when everything looks fine, as tension you carry without knowing why. You get used to it. You call it normal. You forget that things can feel lighter. There are questions you haven't asked because you're afraid of what they might change. If you admit the truth, you might have to act. If you name what hurts, you might have to let something go. Avoidance lets you stay in between, not miserable enough to leave, not honest enough to move forward. 10 minutes removes that in-between space. It doesn't force answers, but it removes the noise you've been using to avoid hearing the questions. When things get quiet, you start noticing where your attention goes, what thoughts you push away, what feelings you label as unnecessary. That's where avoidance lives. You've been telling yourself you don't have time to deal with certain things, but time was never the issue. Willingness was. And willingness doesn't come from pressure. It comes from realizing that carrying unresolved weight costs more energy than facing it. Avoidance promises relief, but it only offers delay. Whatever you don't face waits for you. It waits in your reactions, in your irritability, in your distance from people who get too close, in your tendency to shut down right when things start to matter. You've mastered the art of distraction. You know exactly how to redirect your attention when something feels uncomfortable. You scroll, you plan, you replay old conversations, you jump ahead to worst-case scenarios, anything to avoid staying with what's actually happening. But avoidance keeps you fragmented. Part of you is always managing something in the background, always monitoring, always bracing. That's exhausting. Not because life is too heavy, but because you're carrying it unevenly. 10 minutes doesn't ask you to relive everything you've avoided. It asks you to stop running for a moment and notice what's chasing you. Often what you're avoiding isn't as powerful as the energy you spend avoiding it. There's a fear that if you confront certain truths, you'll collapse, that everything you've held together will fall apart. But most of the time, what actually happens is the opposite. Things start to make sense. The tension has a reason. The fatigue has a source. Naming it doesn't weaken you. It organizes your experience. Avoidance also shapes your identity. You start defining yourself by what you don't touch, what you don't talk about, what you don't want to feel. You become careful, controlled, predictable, safe. But safety built on avoidance has limits. It keeps you from depth as much as it keeps you from pain. You've told yourself stories to make avoidance feel responsible. Now isn't the right time. Other people need me. I can't afford to fall apart. I'll deal with it when things are more stable. Those stories kept you functioning, but they also kept you from listening to yourself. 10 minutes doesn't demand courage in the dramatic sense. It asks for honesty in the quiet sense, the kind that happens when no one is watching and there's nothing to prove. Just you noticing where you tense up, where your breath changes, where your mind tries to escape. Avoidance thrives on speed, on constant motion, on not staying with anything long enough for it to register. Slowing down is its opposite. When you slow down, patterns become visible. You start seeing what you consistently avoid and what it costs you. You may realize that some of the things you're avoiding are no longer relevant, that they only have power because you've never looked at them directly. Avoidance can freeze things in time. Confrontation lets them move, change, shrink. You don't need to judge yourself for avoiding things. Avoidance was once a solution. It helped you cope when you didn't have better tools. But solutions have expiration dates. What protected you then may be limiting you now. 10 minutes gives you just enough space to recognize that something wants your attention, not to overwhelm you, just to be acknowledged. A feeling you've been postponing, a decision you've been circling, a truth you've been editing. Avoidance often sounds like logic, like reasons, like explanations. Confrontation sounds quieter. It sounds like a simple acknowledgement. This matters. This hurts. This isn't working anymore. You don't need to dramatize. For it to be real. You've been living with unresolved things so long, they've started to feel like part of who you are, but they're not. They're experiences you haven't finished processing. 10 minutes won't complete them, but it can begin separating them from your identity. There's relief in naming what you've been avoiding. Not relief because it goes away, but relief because you're no longer pretending it's not there. That pretense takes energy. Letting it go frees some of that energy immediately. Avoidance keeps you focused on control, on managing appearances, on keeping everything contained. Confrontation shifts your focus to truth, and truth doesn't require constant management. It just asks to be recognized. You might notice resistance right now, a desire to move on, to get to the next thing, to say you understand and disengage. That impulse is familiar. That's avoidance protecting itself. You don't need to fight it, just notice it. 10 minutes is enough to see how often you abandon moments before they get honest, how often you change the subject internally, how often you tighten instead of staying open. That awareness alone changes something. Avoidance doesn't mean you failed, it means you adapted, but adaptation without reflection turns into limitation. These 10 minutes are reflection, not analysis, not self-criticism, just noticing what is. You don't have to confront everything today, you just have to stop pretending there's nothing to confront. That shift is subtle, but it's powerful. It changes how you relate to yourself moving forward. Once you see what you've been avoiding, you can't fully go back to not seeing it. You might still delay, you might still hesitate, but there's a difference now. The avoidance is conscious, and conscious avoidance doesn't last forever. 10 minutes won't fix a lifetime of avoidance, but it can interrupt it. It can introduce a pause where there used to be automatic escape. And in that pause, you begin relating to yourself differently, with less judgment, less urgency, more honesty, recognizing that facing something doesn't mean being consumed by it. It means allowing it to exist without immediately trying to outrun it, understanding that what you avoid doesn't define you, but how you relate to it shapes your life, and that even this small act of staying, of listening, of not turning away right now, is already a quiet form of courage that changes the direction of things without needing to announce itself or conclude anything at all.